Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 8th, 2020. Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 8th, 2020. Iran fires on U.S. forces at 2 bases in Iraq, calling it fierce revenge. Iran attacked 2 bases in Iraq that house American troops with a barrage of missiles early Wednesday, Iranian official news media and United States officials said, fulfilling Tehran's promise to retaliate for the killing of a top Iranian commander. United States officials initially said there were no immediate indications of American casualties, and senior Iraqi officials later said there were no American or Iraqi casualties in the strikes. Reports from American intelligence agencies of an imminent attack from Iran had intensified throughout the day, and senior officials had said they were bracing for some kind of attack against American bases in Iraq or elsewhere in the Middle East. Pressed for details on Soleimani strike, Trump administration gives few. Under increasing pressure to defend the killing of a top Iranian general in Iraq, senior Trump administration officials offered new justifications but little details on Tuesday, citing threats to the American embassy in Baghdad and intelligence suggesting other imminent attacks that helped prompt the strike. Before the drone strike that killed the general, the pro-Iranian protesters had attacked barricades outside the American embassy in Baghdad, and American officials feared the attacks could resume and the situation could easily grow more dangerous, threatening the diplomats and military personnel who work at the compound. General Soleimani had arrived in Baghdad to pressure the Iraqi government to kick out American forces after attacks by United States on Katib Hezbollah, an Iraqi militia group with ties to Iran, according to American officials. Scarier than Hurricane Maria, a deadly earthquake terrifies Puerto Rico. The strong 6.4 magnitude earthquake that rocked Puerto Rico on Tuesday plunged almost the entire island into a blackout similar to the one following Maria, reduced some homes to rubble, and triggered new fears that the government would find itself overwhelmed by catastrophe. A United States Commonwealth facing crushing debt and bankruptcy on the heels of a political upheaval that ousted 2 governors last summer found itself asking, again? I prefer Maria, declared Nicole Santos Torres, 21, Ms. Torres' daughter, as she sat surrounded by relatives outside the Juan Pachin Vicens Auditorium in Ponce, the biggest city in southern Puerto Rico, the region most affected by the quake. After spending $3.2 billion erecting some 52,000 new electrical poles and stringing 6,000 miles of wire from the federal government alone, the Puerto Rico electricity system was left in not much better condition than it was before Maria cut power to every home and business on the island. McConnell says he will proceed on impeachment trial without witness deal. Speaker Nancy Pelosi indicated it may not persist much longer, saying that she would soon transmit the 2 articles of impeachment, though not before Mr. McConnell made public the rules for the process. Mr. Trump directed a campaign to stonewall the House impeachment inquiry, barring testimony from some of his closest advisors and refusing to provide any documents. She accused Mr. McConnell of being loyal to Mr. Trump rather than the Constitution and pursuing a trial designed to deprive senators and the American people of crucial documents and testimony. A decision to transmit the articles could come as soon as this week, though a series of Iranian attacks on American forces early Wednesday in Iraq left the exact timing in doubt. Elizabeth Wurtzel, Prozac Nation author, is dead at 52. Her mother, Lynn Ellen Winters, was married to Donald Wurtzel, and until recently, Miss Wurtzel had assumed that he was her father. Unfortunately, the title and cover preview the book's central title and cover preview the book's central confusion. What exactly about a difficult woman is worthy of praise, as well as Wurtzel's own insecurities as a writer and grown-up. The book didn't do as well as it might have been because by the time it came out, Miss Wurtzel was struggling with the drug addiction she later detailed in More, Now, Again. In that book, she bluntly described how she would feed her addiction by whatever means necessary. In 1995, in an afterword to the new edition of Prozac Nation, Miss Wurtzel sought to draw a broader lesson from her landmark book. A victim's account fuels a reckoning over abuse of children in France. For years, though less aggressive than Liberation, Le Monde, the centrist newspaper, published a weekly column by Mr. Matzneff and articles defending those accused of having sex with underage partners, including one in 1977 that was signed by Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Barthes. Bernard Pivot, who invited Mr. Matzneff several times into his televised literary show, Apostrophes, said that back in the 1980s, literature was more important than morality. We are all the intellectual and moral products of a country and especially of a time, he said, adding that he regretted lacking the words that were needed in interviewing Mr. Matzneff. In one program in 1990, the one guest to criticize Mr. Matzneff was the only foreigner present, Denise Bombardier, a Canadian writer who called the writer pathetic and his writing boring. Right now, she said, after listening to the host and other guests talk playfully and joke with Mr. Matzneff about his preference for underage girls, I feel as if I'm on another planet. Pedro Sanchez will lead modern Spain's first coalition government. The leader of the Socialist Party in Spain, Pedro Sanchez, was narrowly approved as Prime Minister of Parliament on Tuesday, clearing his way to form the country's first coalition government since the return to democracy in the 1970s. Directly addressing Mr. Sanchez, Mr. Casado said, "Now the problem will be yours. If you meet the demands of your anti-system partners, you will break up Spain. If not, then they will throw you out onto the street." Mr. Sanchez responded by pledging that his government would end the toxic climate that Mr. Casado and other right-wing lawmakers were fueling, and would instead work to ease nationalist tensions within Spain. Mr. Casado warned that his party would take legal action against Mr. Sanchez and his government if they did not ensure the removal of Quim Torra, the president of the Catalan Regional Administration. Chinese immigrant evades murder verdict in killing of wealthy relative in Canada. In an unexpected ruling on Tuesday, Justice Terence Schultz at the Supreme Court of British Columbia ruled that Zhao Li, now 59, who was a business partner of the victim, Yuan Gang, was not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter and of interfering with human remains. Justice Schultz said that while he did not find Mr. Zhao's testimony to be truthful, he had been left with reasonable doubt over whether Mr. Zhao intended to kill Mr. Yuan. The Zhaos were increasingly revolted by Mr. Yuan's endless stream of girlfriends, as many as 100, according to testimony in separate civil cases over Mr. Yuan's estate. During this trial, Mr. Zhao's lawyer, Ian Donaldson, told the court that his client was a normal, healthy person who had been subject to provocation. The prosecutor countered that it was irrefutable that Mr. Zhao had killed Mr. Yuan. Venezuela's National Assembly opens for business. Scuffles, tear gas, and doused lights. National Guardsmen in body armor initially prevented Juan Guiado, the leader of the country's opposition, from entering the building along with his supporters. In early morning, Mr. Guaido's rival, Luis Parra, opened assembly proceedings, but left before the opposition lawmakers pushed their way in. On Sunday, government forces prevented Mr. Guaido and some of his allies from entering the assembly for a vote to decide who would lead the body. Libya's rebels capture key coastal city and threat to UN-backed government. Forces loyal to the militia leader Khalifa Hifter swept into the city, Surt, on Monday, days after Turkey announced that it was deploying troops to prop up a weak United Nations-backed government. The fall of Surt is a significant blow to the government, which has been under siege from Mr. Hifter's forces since April. If Mr. Hifter can hold Surt, analysts say, his forces could stretch government forces even thinner by drawing fighters away from the defense of Tripoli. Koala mittens and baby bottles, saving Australia's animals after fires. Since the fires, they're very different, she said, of the animals, very on edge. As wildfires have killed at least 24 people, destroyed more than 1,400 homes, and ravaged 15 million acres, they have also inflicted a grievous toll on Australia's renowned wildlife. Here's how to help victims of Australia's fires. Image a koala. Let me erase this. Here's how to help victims of Australia's fires. On Kangaroo Island, off the coast of South Australia, experts said thousands of kangaroos and koalas had been killed in the fires that now ravaged a third of the island. Some NATO troops begin leaving Iraq. For the security of NATO personnel, the organization said in a statement that it would be taking precautions, including the temporary repositioning of some personnel to different locations both inside and outside Iraq. NATO, which has been running the training operation since 2018, will continue to maintain a presence in Iraq and remains committed to fighting international terrorism, an official said, while refusing to divulge details about troop movements. 30 of the 120 German soldiers in Iraq will be sent to Jordan and Kuwait, while others will remain positioned in the less volatile Kurdish region of northern Iraq, the German Defense and Foreign Ministry said in a joint letter to the German parliament, the Bundestag. About 5,200 troops in Iraq and several hundred in Syria are now focused on fortifying their outposts instead of pursuing remnants of the Islamic State and training local forces. A strategy for the Mideast that has even Trump's allies scratching their heads. If even the Pentagon does not know whether it is coming or going in Iraq, it might be hard to blame the rest of the world for being a little confused about President Trump's strategy for the Middle East. Mr. Pompeo has been a forceful public advocate for both the president generally and the strike specifically, but he and others like Defense Secretary Mark T. Esper have been caught out trying to talk their way around things the president has already said. Shalom Lipner, a former advisor to 7 Israeli prime ministers, said even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the president's staunchest allies in the Middle East, has whiplash from Mr. Trump's latest action, having assumed the American president would not take decisive action against Iran this year. Pompeo upended Middle East by pushing Trump to kill Iranian general. Pompeo's end run got the decision he may have wanted, but the messy day after, sloppy explanations of the threat, disorganized public statements, and hasty diplomatic and military efforts limited the effectiveness of the policy and made it far riskier for the country and president, said John Gans, a former chief speechwriter at the Pentagon, and author of a new book on the National Security Council, which includes Mr. Pompeo. As director of the CIA and then Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo has warned his subordinates that he does not want to see any Benghazis. Mr. Trump and Mr. Pompeo were outraged by images of pro-Iran protesters in Baghdad on December 31st, attacking buildings at the United States Embassy, though no American were injured. After the December 31st breach of the American Embassy in Baghdad, Mr. Pompeo pushed harder for the strike against Mr. Soleimani, which Defense Department officials had presented to Mr. Trump as an extreme and not particularly palatable option only days earlier. Tucker Carlson dissents as right-wing media weighs Trump's Iran strike. Mr. Bannon, the former chief of Breitbart News, now runs a pro-Trump podcast, War Room, Impeachment. In the interview, he said he was concerned that a burgeoning conflict in Iran could threaten Mr. Trump's support among working-class, middle-class people, particularly people whose sons and daughters actually fight in these wars, a group that believed the president opposed significant foreign intervention. Mr. Carlson, a longtime opponent of American involvement in the Middle East, has been more willing than Mr. Hannity to criticize Mr. Trump, though he has not called out the president by name in his recent commentary on Iran. On Monday, Mr. Bannon used his podcast to point out the contradictions of the president's approach, noting one of the central building blocks of why he was elected president was to get out of these foreign wars. A co-host, the former Trump campaign aide Jason Miller, leaped to the president's defense, but Mr. Bannon interrupted. A one-word accusation swirls around Trump's deadly strike: assassination. Killing Mr. Soleimani solely for political reasons or in the absence of a sufficient legal rationale, like an imminent threat, would open Mr. Trump to charges that the killing was unlawful and therefore an assassination. While the Trump administration had not presented a rationale under international law, Mary Ellen O'Connell, a University of Notre Dame law professor, argued on EJIL Talk, a site on international law, that details released so far do not meet the conditions of lawful self-defense that would be necessary to make the killing legal under international law. Which legal framework even applies to the killing? What does it mean for a threat to be imminent? Is that even the proper test for today? Samuel Mayon, a Yale Law School professor also on the podcast, questioned whether on a topic like assassination, legal definitional matters really could or should be taken in isolation. He fled Iran as a child. Now he's commanding a U.S. aircraft carrier. For many Iranian Americans, like Captain Hakimzadeh, who served in the United States Armed Forces, the oppression and turmoil of the Iranian Revolution cultivated an appreciation for the liberty that the United States military vows to uphold and defend, and inspired many to enlist. It's certainly a testament to the United States of America that a guy named Kavan Hakimzadeh can do that, he said. Others wanted to use their language skills as a weapon to fight the dictatorship that ran us out of our homes. Now that violence is escalating between the United States and Iran, she said Iranian veterans are of two minds. Hurt Bibles or hot coffee, how one church is preparing for attacks. The Gainesville police charged a 16-year-old white girl with planning a racially motivated knife attack to kill the black worshippers. A plot, they said, bore eerie similarity to a 2015 massacre at a storied African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina. In Gainesville, a small city of about 40,000 residents in the heart of Georgia's poultry industry, the police chief has urged church members to use low-tech force to protect themselves. Last week, a gunman opened fire during Sunday service at a Texas church, killing 2 parishioners before an armed member of the church's volunteer security team fatally shot him. After a gunman stormed the small church in Sutherland Springs in November 2017, a Dallas area megachurch organized an active shooter training session, which more than 600 church leaders from across the country attended. Prosecutors ask that Michael Flynn get prison time. Prosecutors once praised Mr. Flynn's assistance, saying it was particularly valuable because he was one of the few people with long-term and first-hand insight regarding events and issues under investigation, citing his cooperation ahead of his initial sentencing in December 2018. Prosecutors did not push for prison time. Mr. Flynn then changed his story on the eve of Mr. Keane's trial, where Mr. Flynn was critical to the government's case. In addition to rejecting Mr. Flynn's accusations against prosecutors last month, Judge Sullivan rebuked him at his first sentencing, expressing disgust at Mr. Flynn's effort to mislead federal investigators and dismissing suggestions he had been treated unfairly. Judge signals approval of the USC's $215 million settlement with ex-gynecologist patients. The judge, Stephen V. Wilson of United States District Court, said in court on Monday that he was inclined to accept the settlement, which would clear the way for the university to start writing checks to more than 18,000 women who saw Dr. Tyndall during their time at the university, according to lawyers involved in the case. Within 5 months, the University of Southern California agreed to pay $215 million to settle the suit, and Judge Wilson granted preliminary approval of the settlement in June 2019, after an internal investigation conducted by the USC concluded that the gynecologist's behavior had amounted to sexually harassing patients. Dr. Tyndall, now 73, reached an agreement with the university and quietly resigned with a payout in 2017. Boy Scouts of America is sued over sexual abuse allegations. 8 men who say they were sexually abused as children by Boy Scouts of America leaders sued the organization in Washington, D.C. on Monday, accusing it of failing to provide a safe environment and of covering up decades of sexual abuse, a group of lawyers representing the men said in a statement. A similar case in Pennsylvania abused and Scouting represents 1,551 men across the country who say they suffered abuse as children. In August 2019, the organization represented a man now in his 50s in a lawsuit that said that an assistant scoutmaster sexually abused him in the mid-1970s when he was a scout in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. The scout says the Boy Scouts' negligent, willful, wanton, reckless, and tortious acts and omissions allowed the abuse to happen. While white prosecutor Doug Evans asked to recuse himself from Curtis Flowers' case. For decades, Doug Evans, a white district attorney, was dogged in his prosecution of Curtis Flowers, a black man, for a 1996 quadruple murder in Winona, Mississippi, even as the case collapsed 6 times in mistrials or convictions that were reversed on appeal. Jim Hood, the outgoing Attorney General of Mississippi, whose last day in office is Thursday, said the trial court and his successor, Lynn Fitch, would determine who prosecutes the case after Mr. Evans is recused. Mr. Hood said in a statement that Mr. Evans was an honest lawman and that facts are sufficient for the case to be retried. Appellate courts are made up of humans just like all of us, Mr. Hood said. Joe Biden, seeking commander-in-chief moment, denounces Trump's Iran escalation. Mr. Biden cast Mr. Trump as a hypocrite who preaches an inward-looking foreign policy but operates using unsteady bellicose tactics and faulted the president for bringing the nation dangerously close to war after an American drone strike that killed one of Iran's top military commanders, Major General Qasem Soleimani. In Mr. Biden's telling, the chaos America now confronts, heightened threat, chance of death to America once more echoing across the Middle East, with Iran and its allies vowing revenge. Was stoked by Mr. Trump's withdrawal with... Wait, what? In Mr. Biden's telling, the chaos America now confronts, heightened threats, chance of death to America once more echoing across the Middle East, with Iran and its allies vowing revenge, was stoked by Mr. Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated under the Obama administration. Mr. Biden said that if there was an imminent threat that warranted this extraordinary action, Americans should receive an explanation and the facts to back it up. At precisely the moment when we should be rallying our allies to stand beside us and hold the line against threats, Donald Trump's short-sighted America First dogmatism has come home to roost, Mr. Biden said. Days after Soleimani killing, Trump campaign promotes it on Facebook. Political campaigns often run many digital ads with similar versions of a message, and Mr. Trump's campaign is among the most prolific advertisers on Facebook, often running hundreds of ads with subtle differences. First, potential voters are shown the ad. Clicking on it brings them to a brief survey on the Trump campaign's website, which asks questions like, "Do you believe America has the greatest military in the world?" The survey also asks for a name, email address, and phone number, which the campaign can then add to its database of potential donors. Users who submit the survey are also prompted to donate right away with a message that says, "President Trump is keeping America safe. Now it's time to step up and stand behind him." Donation buttons range from $42 to $2,800, appearing below the text. Elizabeth Warren's bankruptcy plan revives old clash with Biden. Bankruptcy is a critical part of the political origin story of Miss Warren, whose new plan would make it easier for families to file for bankruptcy and increase accountability for creditors. In the plan she outlined on Tuesday, Miss Warren would ease bankruptcy rules, allowing students to declare student debt as part of any bankruptcy filing and let more families keep their homes and cars while declaring bankruptcy. Miss Warren did take one notable swipe at Mr. Biden over the bankruptcy bill. On the day he entered the race in April, she said the fact that she had sided with consumers and families was a matter of public record. "I got in that fight because they just didn't have anyone," Miss Warren said, and Joe Biden was on the side of the credit card companies, but that proved to be more of an isolated note. Deval Patrick hopes for an unlikely surge, but for many, it's awfully late. Perhaps the biggest embarrassment for Mr. Patrick, one of two remaining black candidates in the campaign, came in late November, when a planned event at Morehouse College, the historic black institution in Atlanta, was canceled because only 2 people attended. Mr. Patrick has long-standing ties in South Carolina, and Abe Rakov, his campaign manager, said that many voters remembered Mr. Patrick's appearances at churches and town halls across the state in 2008 to support the presidential candidacy of Barack Obama, then a senator. At a meet-and-greet event for Mr. Patrick in a private home in Concord, one voter said she had been swayed by Mr. Patrick's message after leaning toward former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. "After listening, I think he has more substance to his answers," said the voter, Sally Hatch, 71, a Concord political activist working on a grassroots effort to oust President Trump. Bloomberg and Trump buy Super Bowl ads at $10 million each. Hours after the New York Times reported Mr. Bloomberg's plans, President Trump's re-election campaign said that it, too, had reserved 60 seconds worth of advertising during the game for roughly $10 million. President Trump made the unprecedented decision to keep the campaign open following his first election, which allows us to do things like buying a Super Bowl ad, said Tim Murtaugh, a spokesman for the Trump campaign. Bloomberg is running a national campaign. And the most efficient way to reach a lot of people in a national campaign is buying an ad in a top-rated show. And as expensive as it is, it's cheaper than buying the ads market by market. Mr. Trump's campaign also has deep pockets. Soleimani's killing creates new uncertainty for Trump campaign. The ads refer to Mr. Trump as leadership. The ads refer to Mr. Trump's leadership as commander-in-chief and direct voters to an official Trump military survey, which acts as a portal to his campaign website. Mr. Trump's action on Iran reinforces his weaknesses, said Jeff Guerin, a Democratic pollster, and played into his view of Mr. Trump as a rash decision maker. Americans want to see their president acting decisively and defending the nation's interests. And that's exactly what President Trump did, Mr. Murtaugh said. Donor to Trump inauguration charged with obstructing investigation. The donor, Ahmad Zuberi, had pleaded guilty last year to separate charges brought by federal prosecutors in Los Angeles related to earlier campaign donations, as well as lobbying and tax violations. In a court filing on Tuesday, prosecutors said some of the funds Mr. Zuberi donated to the inaugural committee came from other people, including an unnamed American man who wrote a $50,000 check to Avenue Venture to secure exclusive access to certain inaugural events promised by Mr. Zuberi. The foreigner, who is not named in court filing, transferred approximately $5.8 million to the account of Mr. Zuberi, used to fund his $900,000 inaugural donation, the prosecutor said. Donor to Trump inauguration. Echoes of Kavanaugh's fight as Bolton complicates impeachment trial plans. There will be votes at the beginning on whether to call 4 witnesses we proposed and subpoena the documents we've identified. America and the eyes of history will be watching what my Republican colleagues do. At the moment, Republicans appear content to plunge ahead with their approach modeled on the Clinton proceeding, and Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky and the majority leader, is confident he has his troops on board. During the Kavanaugh battle, Republicans held a 51-49 advantage and could afford to lose only 1 vote, making every vote essential. Republicans now control the Senate for 53-47 and have more room to maneuver since Democrats would need to win 4 votes from Republicans to call witnesses. Trump falsely claims that Ukraine aid arrived ahead of schedule. James F. Jeffrey, the State Department Special Envoy for Syria, said in August that about 8,000 ISIS fighters from Syria and Iraq and another 2,000 foreign fighters were being detained by the Syrian Democratic Forces, the loose coalition of militias fighting the terrorist group. As for Mr. Trump's contention that a few ISIS fighters are Greek nationals, the nonprofit Counter-Extremism Project concluded that the number was not well documented, but said that Greece had been used as a transit point for fighters of European origin. The very large numbers of fighters on the ground and the fighters coming from Syria, from Iraq. Other claims, this needs to be erased. Mr. Trump also revealed claims that the New York Times has previously fact-checked, including his oft-repeated falsehood that he opposed the Iraq war in the first place and his exaggerated contention that European countries are not contributing assistance to Ukraine. Why are so many earthquakes happening in Puerto Rico? Why are there so many earthquakes in Puerto Rico right now? At about 3 times the size of Rhode Island, Puerto Rico is squeezed between the border of the North American and Caribbean tectonic plates. We're just as likely to have earthquakes as a place like California, Japan, New Zealand, Alaska, said Elizabeth Vanacore, a seismologist with the Puerto Rico Seismic Network. How rare are earthquakes in the region? Puerto Rico has seen damaging earthquakes before, but major earthquakes in the southwest part of the island are unusual in recent history. Puerto Rico. Can Trump make foreign policy a Democratic campaign issue? President Trump's assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's intelligence and security services, has pushed foreign policy to center stage in the Democratic primary race for president. Whether it's his abandonment of the Kurds in Syria, his antagonism of America's allies, his coddling of hostile autocrats, his disdain for multilateral agreements, or his manipulation of America's Ukraine policy for his own political gain, a move that led to his becoming the third president ever impeached. This president has given Americans reasons to abandon their complacency on foreign affairs and to increase their concern about Mr. Trump's frightening style of leadership. The people a president turns to for advice can be as important as his or her expertise, yet another lesson that past presidents have provided by their failures. When politicians get a license to lie, A company spokesman told me Tuesday that if Facebook determines a politician has shared manipulated media in an ad, Facebook will remove it. Would Facebook allow distribution of a deepfake video if it were shared by a president as a rationale for the bombing of Iran? Such a hypothetical post would certainly be newsworthy, though such a video would be a clear violation of Facebook's rules. Facebook's policy on these cases is a vague pledge to weigh the public interest value against the risk of harm. Who exactly at Facebook would be doing that weighing? Who determines the nature of potential harms? It's unclear. We can't afford Trump as our commander-in-chief. I'm scared because all presidents are only as good as the counsel they seek and the counselors who provide it. And Trump has burned through so many top advisors and so much goodwill that he operates with a hollowed-out staff of half-baked expert experience. Is Trump's spectacular turnabout a function of fresh developments or a spasm of ego? We're always yoked to a president's psyche, to George W. Bush's itch for separation from his father, to Barack Obama's investment in his own unflappability. In his essay entitled A Dangerous Man in Perilous Times, he noted that the best anyone can say about Trump's spasmodic conduct is that it won't matter. Serious moments demand sober and rational minds at the helm, and the president's behavior so far does not inspire confidence, Rothman added. Tessa Majors and the worst thing I ever heard. So much death, laments King Theoden in Tolkien's The Two Towers. The question he asks next is one that I too struggle to answer. What can men do against such reckless hate? Because it's just not possible to delete messages for every terrible thing the world contains. An even worse response, which I'm also guilty of, is to answer hate with hate. Aeschylus, in his play Agamemnon, wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until, in our own despair, against our own will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." I have spent a lot of time this last decade thinking about hate, about the pain which cannot forget, feeling it fall upon my heart and upon the hearts of those I love. The arrogance of Trump's enablers. The House's impeachment vote should overrule any ethical or legal obligation. The House's impeachment vote should overrule any ethical or legal objection these witnesses now have to testifying before the Senate. Mr. Bolton's new flexibility should reinforce the resolve of the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, not to transmit the articles of impeachment to the Senate until Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, agrees to a fair trial that includes critical witnesses. As part of the rules it must pass to govern its impeachment trial, the Senate should also pass a resolution authorized by a 1978 law demanding these witnesses' testimony and seeking a declaratory judgment from the District of Columbia Federal Court, requiring these witnesses to testify promptly. It's time to calibrate fears of a cyber war with Iran. In the aftermath of the American killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani and Iranian retaliation Tuesday against American personnel in Iraq, many are wondering what role cyber warfare will play. As the most common targets are civilian, electrical grids, hospitals, water supplies, transportation infrastructure, cyber warfare disproportionately threatens citizens, linking American foreign policy with the everyday lives of ordinary Americans. Recent research suggests that the effects of cyber attacks must be extensive in order to sway American public opinion. Americans are significantly less likely to support retaliation against cyber attacks than against airstrikes, even if both caused the same damage. Voices of anxiety as Australia burns. Mr. Flanagan is correct that our country is deeply affected by climate change, resulting in widespread drought and catastrophic bushfires through large swaths of the country. We loaded the car and joined the thousands of other Australians across the country who were evacuating their homes in regional areas. Countries buying Australian coal and gas would get it somewhere else. John Bolton offers to testify. If Mr. McCartney decides he does not wish to hear what Mr. Bolte has to say, perhaps Mr. Bolte would agree to appear before the House of Representatives Intelligence Committee in a phase 2 of its impeachment inquiry. White House officials are tying themselves in knots trying to say that the President Trump did not say he would consider attacking cultural sites in Iran. Many are renters who are shut out of their homes this is multiple editorials. Many are renters who are shut out of their homes over only a few $100s, often less than 1 month's rent. In cities with a right to counsel like Philadelphia, lawyers help keep renters in their homes. Just 700 speak this language, 50 in the same Brooklyn building. Seke is one of 637 languages and dialects that the Endangered Language Alliance has identified as being spoken across the 5 boroughs of New York and in the endangered The Endangered Language Alliance considers a language in peril when there are fewer than 10,000 speakers worldwide. There is not enough material to pass their language to new generations. Even if a language is spoken by only a few people, language experts say it still plays a vital role. Nepali is the invader, she said, though adding after some reflection, but it's not their fault. We give power to a language because we use it. If we were vigilant, we would say, no, I'm not going to speak. If we were vigilant, we would say, no, I'm going to speak Seke. But we gave in to the influence. Nawang Gurung, a New York-based translator who is archiving languages in the Himalayas, said over 100 Tibeto-Burman languages were spoken in the Himalayas, but now they are not recognized by the Nepalese government. And there have been few efforts to teach indigenous languages in schools. Charlize Theron and Salma Hayek are named as possible Weinstein witnesses. The actresses Salma Hayek, Rosie Perez, and Charlize Theron were among the people that a judge said on Tuesday might be called as witnesses or mentioned in testimony during the rape trial of the movie producer Harvey Weinstein. The list provided a rough cast of characters for the trial and also included several of Mr. Weinstein's business partners and employees, among them his brother, Robert Weinstein. One of Mr. Weinstein's lawyers, Arthur Adala, appeared taken back. You said you never want to see a cell phone in my client's hand. The judge then reminded Mr. Weinstein that his bail would be revoked and that he would be jailed during his trial if he did not stop using his telephone. Ken Friedman of the Spotted Pig will pay $240,000 in sexual harassment case. Ken Friedman, the principal owner of the Spotted Pig restaurant in Manhattan, has agreed to pay $240,000 and a share of his profits to 11 former employees who have accused him of sexual harassment, retaliation, and discrimination, as part of a settlement brokered by the New York State Attorney General's office. The former employees will share a $240,000 settlement played out by Mr. Friedy and the restaurant over 2 years. For the next 10 years, 20% of Mr. Friedy's profits, including any money he makes if he sells the business, of which he owns 75 to 80%. Still, the agreement states that she shares some of the responsibility for the hostile workplace. Except for a short period during 2015, the Spotted Pig maintained no human resources department, no sexual harassment policy, and no process by which employees could report complaints about Mr. Friedman other than complaining to the general manager, Mr. Friedman himself, or Bloomfield. Despite her ownership and managerial role in the company, Bloomfield took no action to mitigate or prevent future harassment. An October 2018 interview for The Times, Ms. Bloomfield acknowledged not doing enough to protect employees, but said that she also had been manipulated and terrorized by Mr. Friedy during the working relationship. A decade of turbulence, family love, and basketball. Amid the turbulence in their lives over the last decade, Miss Frances Hartley and her children, Chardonnay and DJ, found a haven at the Children's Aid-operated Dunleavy Millbank Center, the same Harlem Community Center where she'd spent her youth. After Miss Frances Hartley lost her job in the school, she received 2 $50 gift cards to Marshall's from Children's Aid, one of the 7 organizations that the New York Times Neediest Case Fund supports. Miss Frances Hartley decided to quit working for her daily temp jobs to become Chardonnay's full-time caretaker, driving her to and from school, 40 minutes each way, and picking her son up from college each night. Jennifer DeLose's husband is charged with her murder. Miss DeLose returned home about 8 a.m. Then, for hours, she did not respond to text messages or phone calls and failed to show up at several appointments in New York City, according to an arrest warrant for Mr. DeLose. In the arrest warrant for Mr. DeLose, detectives used cell phone records and surveillance footage to track Mr. DeLose from his home in Farmington, Connecticut, to Miss DeLose's home about 75 miles away. During the interviews with investigators, Miss Troconis admitted that she and Mr. DeLose scrawled out false alibis for the days around Miss DeLose's death and on handwritten documents in their Farmington home, the warrant said. The truth about New York's rising murder numbers. Police officials said they often respond to crime flare-ups by increasing police patrols and engaging with prospective and active gang members. Crime experts like Barry Friedman, a professor at New York University School of Law who studies policing tactics, said these numbers do not necessarily signify the crime is out of control in those neighborhoods. If crime has been driven down to historically low levels, the increases look larger on a percentage basis. One category of violent crime fell off. Concrete mixer, sanitation truck, and bus kill 3 NYC pedestrians. Humans are staying the same size. In one of the fatalities on Tuesday, the boy and his mother, 40, were hit by a city sanitation truck in Corona, Queens, shortly before 7 a.m., the police said. The 68-year-old woman was crossing New Utrecht Avenue in the middle of the block near 49th Street when she was hit by a concrete mixing truck, the police said. The driver of the truck, operated by the concrete supplier Ferrara Bros, remained at the scene, the police said, and the investigation is continuing. In reversal, Boeing recommends 737 MAX simulator training for pilots. The FAA said it would consider Boeing's recommendation, adding in a statement that it was following a thorough process, not a set timeline, to ensure that any design modifications of the 737 MAX are integrated with appropriate training and procedures. At least one airline, United, has considered requiring its pilots to undergo simulator training, whether or not the FAA mandates it, recognizing that it make the public more comfortable flying the plane. According to two people familiar with the matter, public, customer, and stakeholder confidence in the 737 MAX is critically important to us. And with that focus, Boeing has decided to recommend MAX simulator training combined with computer-based training for all pilots prior to returning the MAX safely to service. Pilots who are certified to fly both the 737NG and the 737 MAX may have to undergo recurrent training for both models. If a pilot certified to fly the MAX misses a flight, airlines will have to make sure the replacement is certified on the MAX, not just the NG. There are currently 34 certified MAX flight simulators worldwide, according to a person familiar with the matter. Sonos, squeezed by the tech giants, sues Google. Jose Castaneda, a Google spokesman, said Google and Sonos had discussed both companies' intellectual property for years, and we are disappointed that Sonos brought these lawsuits instead of continuing negotiations in good faith. We dispute these claims and will defend them vigorously, he added. Sonos sued Google over only 5 patents, but said it believed Google and Amazon had each violated roughly 100. After Sonos intensified its demands that Google license its technology, Google pushed Sonos to comply with stricter rules for using Google's virtual assistant. Don't tilt scales against Trump, Facebook executives warn. On December 30th, Andrew Bosworth, the head of Facebook's virtual and augmented reality division, wrote on his internal Facebook page that, as a liberal, he found himself wanting to use a social network's powerful platform against Mr. Trump. The post by Mr. Bosworth, a former head of Facebook's advertising team, provides an unusually candid glimpse of the debate raging within Facebook about the platform's responsibilities as it heads into the 2020 election. Mr. Bosworth said he believed Facebook was responsible for Mr. Trump's 2016 election victory, but not because of Russian interference or the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which millions of Facebook users' data was leaked to a political strategy firm that worked with the Trump campaign. Japan issues arrest warrant for Carlos Ghosn's wife. The Japanese authorities said on Tuesday that they had issued a warrant for the arrest of Carol Ghosn, the wife of Carlos Ghosn, taking direct aim at the family of the fallen auto magnate as they sought to bring him back to the court to face criminal charges. In a statement, they said Mrs. Ghosn had testified she did not know a person who was involved in Mr. Ghosn's case, even though she was in communication with that person while that person was wiring money between companies at Mr. Ghosn's request. Last week, MNG Jet, the air charter company that operated the flights that Mr. Ghosn used to leave Japan, brought a criminal complaint against its operations manager, Okan Kosaman. U.S. and France race to conclude digital tax talks as tariff threat looms. The United States and France are racing to reach a compromise in a digital tax dispute that could result in hefty American tariffs on French wine, cheese, handbags, cookware, and more. American officials have called the tax discriminatory and unreasonable and detailed a plan to retaliate by imposing tariffs on porcelain, soap, handbags, wine, yogurt, lipstick, and other French products, though they have not specified the rate or total dollar value of the tariffs that might be imposed. On Tuesday, Mr. Le Maire met with Phil Hogan, the new European Trade Commissioner, who will travel to the United States next week to discuss how to respond to potential American tariffs. Where's your flying car? Hyundai and Uber say they're working on it. In Las Vegas on Monday, at the Consumer Electronics Show, the two companies announced that they were joining forces to develop an all-electric air taxi that would be part of a future aerial rideshare network. We're looking at the dawn of a completely new era that opens the skies above our cities. Jaewon Shin, the head of Hyundai's Urban Air Mobility Division, said at the announcement. In its Monday announcement, Hyundai said it would be able to bring automotive-scale manufacturing to Uber Elevate, the company's aerial ride-hailing division. In addition to Hyundai, its partners include the Boeing subsidiary Aurora Flight Sciences, Bell, Embraer, Joby Aviation, and several real estate companies. Oil prices are slow to reflect U.S.-Iran tensions. Oil can be a highly volatile commodity, and crude oil prices rose by roughly 4% on initial reports Tuesday night that Iran had launched missiles on 2 United States bases in Iraq. David Fife, chief economist at Argos, a research firm, said Tehran would be wary of responses that raised oil prices substantially or jeopardized supplies for China, a key supporter which buys much of the oil Iran sells and is heavily dependent on the Middle East for fuel. If millions of barrels a day of oil production were suspended, that would quickly draw down storage tanks and send oil prices soaring, analysts say, although the United States government could seek to calm markets by releasing fuel from the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. IKEA will pay $46 million to parents of toddler crushed to death by a dresser. The Swedish furniture retailer IKEA agreed to pay a $46 million settlement in a wrongful death lawsuit brought by the parents of a California toddler who was crushed to death by a popular dresser model that had been recalled after at least 5 other children were killed. The Dudex of Buena Park, California, bought the dresser in 2008 and said in the lawsuit they were never alerted to the recall by IKEA. If a 2-year-old child can tip over a 3-drawer dresser, you know there's something wrong with that dresser. Mr. Feldman, the lawyer for the Dudex, said in an interview on Monday. The Nets called it home. Now an NBC drama lives there. Can a sports arena, once universally panned for its drab decor, become the next Universal Studio backlot? There are financial reasons that NBC might consider an extended residency at Meadowlands Arena. Joe Louis Arena in Detroit, which is about the same age and size as Meadowlands Arena, was demolished at a cost of $10 million after the Red Wings hockey team moved out. Think of an arena floor that has no obstructions and can be as high as you want. Normally, you're looking for 24 to 40 feet for television. The idea intrigued Rick Butler, production designer for The Enemy Within, and a New Jersey native who grew up attending concerts in the arena. Inside the billion-dollar battle over .org. In buying the public interest registry, Ethos Capital would acquire the rights to run .org and collect annual fees from the nearly 10.5 million registered .org names, held by both nonprofits and domain name speculators. As the owner of the registry for .org, Ethos Capital would manage the acceptable business practices and conduct .org domains, the same freedoms that open the door to extremist groups on some .org sites, nonprofit leaders say, also help protect free speech on public interest .org sites in developing countries with authoritarian governments. FBI asks Apple to help unlock 2 iPhones. In 2014, Apple started building encryption into iPhones that can be unlocked only with a given device's password, meaning even Apple can't bypass the security. The Pensacola case resembles a 2016 dispute between Apple and the FBI over the iPhone of the man who, along with his wife, shot and killed 14 people in San Bernardino, California. As in that case, there is a dead gunman, a court authorization to gain entry to the phone, and early stalemate between law enforcement and Apple. After the federal judge ordered Apple to create a way to open the San Bernardino gunman's phone in 2016, Tim Cook, Apple's chief executive, responded with a 1,100-word letter in which he said that creating such a backdoor would compromise the security of every iPhone. Facebook says it will ban deepfakes. A company executive said in a blog post late Monday that the social network would remove videos, often called deepfakes, that artificial intelligence has altered in ways that would likely mislead someone into thinking that a subject of a video said words that they did not actually say. The videos would also be banned in ads. Disinformation researchers have referred to similar videos as cheap fakes or shallow fakes, or deceptive content edited with simple video editing software, in contrast to the more sophisticated deepfake videos generated by artificial intelligence. Websites like Pornhub, Twitter, Reddit suppressed the videos, but according to the research firm Deep Trace Labs, these videos still made up 96% of deepfakes found in the last year. And that has been Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 8th, 2020. Again, Reading the Times for Wednesday, January 8th, 2020. Signing off.